The invitation nobody saw coming, the soft rhythm of ocean waves whispered against the hull of the yacht as it gently swayed in the marina. The sun had just begun to dip into the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. Luxury cars purred into the private dock one after another, dropping off men in designer suits and women in glittering gowns. Every detail screamed wealth, the kind of wealth that made others nervous. On the other side of the marina, a slim man in a plain navy shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers stepped out of a modest black car. He paused for a moment, looking at the grand vessel in front of him. His expression unreadable. This man was Sundar Pichai. He wasn't wearing anything flashy. No Rolex, no sunglasses with gold rims. He didn't walk with a crowd of assistants or bodyguards. He walked alone, his hands in his pockets, like a man more comfortable in a conference room than a cocktail party. And that was the problem. Number? One knew who he was, not yet. The yacht was called the Golden Siren. It belonged to a tech billionaire named Bradley Thorpe. Bradley was loud, boastful, and loved being the center of attention. He had made his money creating a streaming service that recently went public. In the world of Silicon Valley, he was new money with a lot to prove. The party was a celebration of his latest milestone, a record-breaking investment round that put his company's valuation in the billions. The guest list was exclusive. Venture capitalists, startup founders, influencers, hedge fund managers, and a few Hollywood celebrities. It wasn't the kind of place where humility was valued. People came to flaunt their wealth, make deals, and gossip about who was up and who was being quietly pushed out. As Sundar approached the entrance of the yacht, a tall security guard stepped forward, blocking his path with a single hand. Invitation? The man asked, not even looking Sundar in the eye. Sundar reached into his pocket and handed over a simple digital pass on his phone. It had come from Bradley himself just a few hours earlier. A brief, last-minute invite with no explanation. The guard squinted at it. Then he looked Sundar up and down at the jeans, the old shoes, the absence of labels. Who sent you this? The guard asked, tone skeptical. Bradley Thorpe. Sundar replied calmly. The guard chuckled and shook his head. Look, man, we get people trying to sneak in all the time. You're clearly in the wrong place. This is a private party. Before Sundar could respond, a woman in a sequin dress walked by and glanced at him. He's probably a technician, she muttered. Maybe here to fix the lights or something. Another guest nearby added with a smirk, or the catering guy who got lost. They all laughed. Sundar didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost amused, but something in his eyes darkened. For a split second, not anger, not even embarrassment. Guess something deeper, something most people couldn't name. He pulled out his phone again. Do you want me to call Bradley? Yes. The guard folded his arms. Go ahead, if you have his number. Sundar dialed. It rang once, then twice, then straight to voicemail. The guard smirked. Yeah, that's what I thought. Before Sundar could say another word, a second security guard approached from inside the yacht. He was younger, looked a little more alert. He leaned into the first guard and whispered something, pointing subtly at Sundar. The first guard frowned. You sure? Yes. The younger guard nodded. Positive. Just saw his photo in the pre-brief this morning. But the first guard didn't budge. Doesn't matter. If he's not dressed right, Bradley won't want him. They let other guests pass while Sundar stood there in silence, still holding his phone. Minutes passed. The sky darkened and fairy lights began to glow on the yacht's railing. Laughter echoed from the deck. The music grew louder. Inside, the party was coming to life, but Sundar remained outside. I am sorry, the younger guard finally said. I know who you are, sir, but you don't look like you belong. And this party is very curated. Sundar looked him in the eyes. I understand. He turned slowly and began to walk back down the dock. Not once did he show anger. Not once did he raise his voice, but inside something stirred. Not because he had been rejected. Sundar had faced rejection many times before during his early days at Google, during board meetings, during moments when his ideas were dismissed. Because of his accent, his background, or his quiet nature. No, What hurt wasn't the humiliation. It was the reminder that humility is often mistaken for weakness. As he walked toward the edge of the marina, a man in an all-white suit and gold loafers stepped off the yacht, laughing loudly. It was Bradley Thorpe. He didn't notice Sundar, right? Away. He was too busy entertaining a pair of investors from Singapore. But then one of the investors paused and did a double take. Is that Sundar Pichai? The man asked. Clearly shocked out, Bradley froze. Where? Right there. Walking away. Bradley's face went pale. You turned him away? The investor asked, his voice rising. I didn't know he was here. Bradley, Staamered. The investor's tone turned sharp. You invited the CEO of Google and then had your security humiliate him? Bradley tried to defend himself, but the damage was already done. The investor was no longer smiling. The other guests overheard, and murmurs began to spread. On the dock, Sundar heard the footsteps behind him. Wait. Bradley called out. Sundar stopped, but didn't turn around. Sundar, I'm so sorry, Bradley said, catching up. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Please come back. I'll personally walk you in. Sundar turned slowly. His expression was calm, but his words were deliberate. Why? He asked softly. Because you belong there, Bradley replied quickly. You're a guest of honor. Sundar nodded slowly. No, I didn't come for champagne or music. I came because you asked me to speak about innovation, to inspire, not to be recognized, not to be flattered. Bradley swallowed hard. But now, Sundar continued, you've shown everyone what this party really values. Bradley looked away. His face red. Then Sundar said something that would stay with everyone who heard it. Kindness, he said, is the only invitation that truly matters. He turned and walked away. But the story was far from over, because what happened next behind the scenes, in the boardrooms, in the headlines, would change everything. Asterisk the storm after silence eve at night. As Sundar drove away from the marina, the city lights flickered past his car window like memories. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages from Bradley, his assistants, and even some of the investors at the yacht party. But Sundar ignored them all. Not out of pride or resentment, but because he was thinking about something else entirely. He remembered his father's face from long ago. The calm, thoughtful man who once told him, your value is not in how people treat you, but in how you respond when they don't. Those words had stayed with Sundar his entire life. They had guided him through challenges that no one saw. Most people looked at him and saw a successful CEO, the leader of Google, one of the most powerful tech minds in the world. But they didn't see the long hours, the heartbreak, the silent sacrifices behind that calm exterior. As he reached home, the house was dark. His wife was already asleep. He walked quietly to his study and sat by the window, watching the sky. It had started to rain soft drops at first, then heavier. The storm outside seemed to echo the silence inside him. Not sadness, not anger, but reflection. He opened his laptop and began typing a message. Not to Bradley, not to the investors, but to his team. An internal message that would ripple through every hallway at Google the next morning. I read. Yesterday, I was reminded that how we treat people when we don't recognize them is the truest test of our values. Whether someone is wearing a suit or sneakers, holding a title or cleaning a floor, their dignity remains the same. Let's build a company where no one has to prove they belong. The message was quiet, brief, but it struck deep. By sunrise. It had been shared thousands of times inside Google and beyond. Screenshots leaked to social media. Forums buzzed with admiration. Journalists caught wind of it, and headlines began appearing. Sundar Pichai turns humiliation into powerful message about dignity. Google CEO refused entry to luxury yacht responds. With grace, a lesson in humility from the most powerful man in tech. Meanwhile, at the Golden Siren yacht, Bradley Thorpe woke up to a different kind of storm. His phone was on fire. Hundreds of missed calls, angry emails, partners pulling out, investors demanding answers. Even a few employees had resigned overnight. The Singapore investors, the same ones who had spotted Sundar, had already backed out of their deal, a deal worth over $100 million. Gone. Just like that. Bradley sat in his silk robe, staring at the news articles, flooding his screen. His publicist had already drafted 3 different statements. All hollow, all desperate. We can do damage control, his lawyer insisted. But Bradley knew better. This wasn't about saving face. This was about something deeper. Something he had ignored for far too long. Because behind every startup, every pitch deck, every round of funding, there were people, real people. And somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that by noon, his team scheduled an emergency board meeting. Bradley showed up 30 minutes late, his face pale and voice strained. I made a mistake, he admitted. A big one. The room was silent. Then one of the board members, an older woman named Miriam who rarely spoke, leaned forward. You didn't just turn away Sundar Pichai, she said slowly. You turned away the very values you pretend to stand for. Bradley couldn't meet her eyes. This company, she continued, has always claimed to build community, to empower the overlooked. But in that moment, you showed us who you really value. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Miriam held up her hand. Don't apologize. To us, she said. Apologize to him. And so he did. Bradley sat down that evening and wrote a public letter. This time, it wasn't crafted by publicists or filtered by lawyers. It was raw, real, and humbling. He posted it on every platform he had access to. Yesterday, I invited one of the most brilliant minds in technology to share his wisdom with US. Instead, he was turned away at the door because we judged him by what he wore, not who he was. I take full responsibility, and I am deeply sorry. Not because of the fallout, but because it took a public mistake for me to see my own blindness. Sundar Pichai, you came to inspire us, and you did, just not in the way I expected. Within hours, the letter went viral. People began sharing their own stories. Stories of being dismissed because of how they looked. Stories of being underestimated. Stories of quiet dignity, resilience, and grace. It became more than just about a party or a yacht. It became a movement. People across the tech industry started conversations about culture, ego, and respect. CEOs began reviewing their own policies. Diversity leaders used the moment as a teaching tool. Companies updated onboarding processes to remind staff that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. And through it all, Sundar remained silent. Not out of spite, but because he knew that real change doesn't come from speeches. It comes from watching what people do after the spotlight fades. A week later, Sundar was walking through a campus cafe at Google when a young intern approached him nervously. Sir, she said, her voice trembling, thank you for what you did. He paused, looked at her kindly, and asked, what did I do? The girl blinked, surprised. You made the world see what kindness really means. Sundar smiled softly. That wasn't me, he said. That was them. I just showed up. The girl didn't understand. Totally. Not yet. But one day, she would. What no one knew was that the story was still unfolding. Because someone had seen Sundar that night at the marina. Not the security guards. Not Bradley. But someone else. Someone who had been sitting on a bench nearby. Unnoticed in the shadows, watching everything unfold. And that person was about to change Sundar's life. Forever. Asterisk the stranger on the bench. May after the storm had passed, the marina was once again quiet. The yacht was still there, shining under the dock lights, but the noise, the champagne, and the chaos had long faded. All that remained was the stillness of the water and a soft breeze whispering across the bay. But on that night, when Sundar had been turned away from the yacht, someone else had been watching from the far end of the dock. Hidden in the shadows, sitting silently on a wooden bench with peeling paint, was an elderly man in a brown jacket. He wasn't part of the tech world. He didn't own a yacht or have millions in the bank. He was just there like the wind, like the ocean, like a witness to something he knew was bigger than anyone realized. His name was Elias. Elias had worked as a ship engineer for most of his life. He had once built engines for massive vessels. and traveled to over 30 countries. But now, at 78, his world was smaller. He lived in a modest apartment just a few streets away, walking to the docks every evening, simply to watch the sea and think on that night he had seen the entire incident unfold. He had seen the security guard stop Sundar. He had seen the guests laugh and walk past. He had seen Sundar stand still, calm but unshakably alone. And he had seen something else, something others didn't. It wasn't just about a man being denied entry to a party. It was about the world, failing to recognize quiet greatness. Again, Elias had grown up in a time when people like him were told to stay in the background. He knew what it meant to be invisible, to be judged, to be labeled before being heard. So when he watched Sundar walk away with grace, not bitterness, he felt something inside him awaken, a memory, a truth, a calling. The next morning, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote a letter, not with a computer, not with a phone, but with a fountain pen on crisp white paper. His handwriting was slow, a little shaky, but filled with care. He began, "Dear Mar Sundar Pichai, I saw what happened to you on the night of the party. I know you don't know me, but I want you to know I saw everything. I've lived long enough to understand what the world does to men like you, quiet men who do not shout to be seen. Your silence that night was louder than all the music on that yacht. Thank you for reminding me and maybe all of us what real strength looks like." Elias folded the letter neatly and placed it in a small envelope. He didn't have a direct address for Sundar, but he knew someone at the local Google campus, a young woman named Lena who often walked her dog near the docks. She had once offered him leftover coffee and chatted about her job. He handed her the envelope the next day. "Can you get this to him?" He asked softly. Lena looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Elias." 3 days later, Sundar opened the envelope in his office. He read the letter once, then twice. Then he set it down and stared out the window for a long moment, eyes glassy. It wasn't the praise that touched him. It was the recognition. A simple human recognition of something the world often overlooked. He asked his assistant to find Elias. That afternoon, a black car pulled up to the same wooden bench by the marina. Elias was there, sipping tea from a thermos, watching the horizon. Sundar stepped out quietly and walked over. "You must be Elias," he said gently. Elias smiled. "And you must be the man they wouldn't let on the yacht." They both laughed softly. There was no tension, no awkwardness. Just the quiet understanding between two men who had walked very different paths and yet understood each other perfectly. They sat on the bench together, just watching the sea. "Thank you for your letter," Sundar said after a long pause. Elias nodded. "You're welcome. I meant every word." "May I ask something?" Sundar said. "Of course." "How did you know it would matter to me?" Elias looked down at his hands. "Because I've been overlooked too," he said. "In factories, in offices, in rooms where I knew more than the man in charge. And yet, I stayed quiet. I did my work. And people assumed I had nothing to say." Sundar nodded slowly. "But I've learned," Elias continued, "that people like us, we don't need the spotlight. We just need the right moment. And that night, you gave the world a moment. They just didn't realize it until it was over." They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about technology, not about business, but about life, about fathers, about failure, about how the world still had so much to learn. Before leaving, Sundar handed Elias a small notebook. "Write more letters," he said. "The world needs your voice." Elias smiled. Touched. What neither of them knew was that someone nearby had recognized Sundar. A teenager named Samir, working as a dock cleaner, had seen him from a distance. He had no idea why Sundar was there, or who the old man beside him was, but Samir had admired Sundar for years. He followed every keynote, every new product launch, every interview, and to see him sitting on a weathered bench, listening to an old man in a brown jacket that shook something in him. That evening, Samir went home and opened his laptop. He wrote a blog post. Just a short one. I saw Sundar Pichai today. Not in a boardroom, not on stage, but on a bench by the marina. Listening to an old man like he was the president. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't bring cameras. He just listened. I want to be like that. He posted it. Didn't think much of it. By morning, it had gone viral. People were tired of empty influencers, loud CEOs, and hollow apologies. They were hungry for something real. And somehow, a bench by the sea had become the most powerful symbol of the week. News outlets picked it up. Google CEO shares quiet moment with retired engineer. An unlikely meeting goes viral. From yacht rejection to marina reflections. Sundar's unexpected turn captures the world. Schools used the story to teach empathy. Corporate leaders shared it in boardrooms. Parents told it to their children at bedtime. And behind all of it, three unlikely people, Sundar, Elias, and Samir, had unknowingly sparked a fire. But just as the world was catching its breath, something unexpected happened. Because tucked inside that notebook Sundar had given Elias was a card. A private invitation. Not to a party, not to a meeting, but to a secret event that would bring together minds and hearts in a way the world had never seen. And it was going to change everything. Asterisk, the invitation that rewrote the rules a week had passed since Sundar sat with Elias on the worn-out bench by the marina. The world had moved fast since then. What started as a moment of humiliation had become a spark. One man's quiet grace had rippled across headlines, classrooms, and hearts. But the real story, what was building beneath the surface, had yet to begin. In a quiet corner of his office, Sundar sat reviewing something that looked nothing like a typical corporate strategy. It wasn't a slide deck. It wasn't a business plan. It was a list, handwritten, folded, and slightly wrinkled. 27 names. Each one carefully chosen, not for their net worth, not for their fame, but for their stories. Each person on that list had one thing in common. They had been overlooked. A former janitor who had invented a water purification system that could change lives but had never found funding. A single mother in Mississippi who ran a coding school out of her garage. A deaf teenager from India who had created a voice-designed translator using recycled parts. A retired teacher who had trained more engineers than any university. And yes, Elias, the man on the bench, Sundar wasn't planning another keynote or panel. He wasn't interested in another corporate summit with suits and talking points. He wanted something different, something radical, a gathering where humility, resilience, and kindness were the currency. A space where ideas would be judged not by who said them, but by the impact they held. He called it the table of 12. 12 guests. One long wooden table. No cameras. No reporters. Just voices that mattered. It was an idea born not from power, but from silence. From being turned away. From sitting beside an old man with no social media following and realizing he had more wisdom than any influencer on the internet. His team didn't understand it at first. No stage. No live stream. His assistant asked, eyebrows raised. No. Sundar said simply, just stories, just truth. The invitations were sent by hand, not by email, not by courier, but by people, actual people who traveled across the country and beyond, knocking on doors, sitting down for tea, explaining what this was and why it mattered. When Elias received his envelope, he was sitting by the same marina, scribbling in the notebook Sundar had given him. He opened the letter slowly. Inside it read, "You changed the way I think about legacy. I hope you'll sit with us." Sundar Elias chuckled softly. "After all these years," he whispered, "I finally get invited to the right table." When the day of the gathering came, it wasn't held at a luxury resort or high-rise hotel. It was held in a quiet, sunlit space just outside the city. A renovated barn surrounded by wildflowers and trees. No flashy decor, no red carpet, just a simple wooden sign at the entrance that read, "Welcome, you belong here." The 12 guests arrived slowly, many of them unsure of what to expect. Few had never even been on a plane before. One woman brought her teenage son because she had no one to watch him. No one was turned away. And Sundar greeted each one. At the door himself. No assistance. No fanfare. Just a smile, a handshake, and words that came from the heart. Thank you for coming. We're honored you're here. This table is for you. As everyone settled around the table, Sundar stood at the head, his voice soft but clear. We live in a world that celebrates noise, he began. But today, we celebrate the quiet, the steady, the unseen. Today we listen. There was no script, no agenda. Just one question. What have you learned that the world needs to hear? And the stories began. A man who had survived prison spoke about rebuilding trust. A young woman who had grown up in foster care shared how she learned to code on borrowed library computers. Elias, with tears in his eyes, spoke of machines, mistakes, and how dignity has no age limit. As each person spoke, the others listened, not just with ears, but with hearts wide open. There were tears, laughter, long pauses filled with meaning. At one point, the single mother from Mississippi turned to Sundar and asked, "Why us?" He looked around the table and said, "Because the world doesn't change from the top. It changes from tables like this, from people like you." After hours of conversation, Sundar reached into a small leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I've created a fund," he said. "It's not named after me. It won't be advertised, but it's for you, for your ideas, for your communities, for your dreams." The room went silent. He continued. "Each of you will receive full backing. No applications. No pitching. No conditions. Just belief." There were gasps. Hands covered mouths. Elias lowered his head, overwhelmed. "Don't want charity." The deaf teenager signed quickly. Through an interpreter. "This isn't charity," Sundar replied. "This is recognition." It was a moment no one at that table would ever forget. But outside that room, the world still hadn't caught on until the following week when one of the guests, the janitor turned inventor, posted a simple photo of the table. No names, no captions, just the 12 chairs, the wooden beams, and sunlight pouring through the windows. The post went viral within hours. People began asking, "What is this table? Who were these people? Why does this feel more important than any tech conference I've ever seen?" Journalists tried to track it down. Influencers tried to copy it. But they couldn't, because it wasn't about going viral. It was about being real. And yet, the table had lit a fire across the world. Small groups started gathering in schools, libraries, homes holding their own table of 12 sessions. Not to talk business, but to share humanity. To listen, to lift each other. It became a quiet movement. And at the center of it was a man who once got turned away at a yacht. A man who decided that humiliation wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something better. But not everyone was happy. Because while the world praised Sundar's humility, there were those in the corporate world who saw it as a threat. That the spotlight was shifting. They didn't like that kindness was becoming more powerful than control. And one of them, someone from Sundar's past, was preparing to challenge everything he stood for. Asterisk. The man behind the curtained table of 12 was just the beginning. Word had spread like wildfire. Not because of press releases or media campaigns, but because of whispers. Quiet whispers that reached people's hearts. It was no longer about Sundar Pichai or a viral blog post or a yacht party. It had become something far greater. An idea, that truth, when spoken gently and with purpose, could change the world more than any product launch or investor deck ever could. But for every movement born of truth, there is resistance. It didn't come with a warning. It came quietly, behind boardroom doors, whispered in strategy meetings and corporate roundtables. Powerful men in expensive suits leaned forward and asked dangerous questions. Who does Sundar think he is? They didn't like what was happening. The table of 12 had shifted public attention from tech empires to human stories, from brands to people, from arrogance to authenticity. And for some, that shift felt like an attack. They called it the Sundar problem. At the heart of that whisper campaign was a man named Victor Drayton. Victor was not a name most people outside Silicon Valley knew, but inside the walls of power, he was feared. Decades ago, he had been a mentor to young, promising minds, including Sundar himself. Back when he was still an engineer with big dreams and quiet habits, Victor had taught Sundar many things: how to lead with data, how to pitch ideas, how to survive in rooms that were never built for men like them. But what Victor didn't teach was empathy. What he didn't value was humility. To him, kindness was weakness dressed in polite language. Sundar had moved on, evolved, and surpassed him. And now, that evolution had become a threat because Victor was building something too. Not a product, not a platform, a campaign. Subtle, strategic, and surgical, he called in old favors, sent out carefully crafted memos, leaked misleading information that questioned Sundar's intentions. Is Sundar Pichai turning Google into a charity? Is he abandoning innovation to focus on social experiments? Are shareholders being ignored in favor of feel-good projects? These questions started showing up in investor calls and tech blogs, not as accusations, but as concerns. Clever words masked as neutrality. Inside Google. The tension began to grow. Employees who had once been inspired by Sundar's message now felt uncertain. Middle managers started tightening budgets. Meetings became more rigid. The internal culture that had bloomed in recent weeks was slowly beginning to shrink back into old patterns of silence and fear. Sundar felt it. In meetings. His team was more cautious. In emails, more formal. Even the cafeteria felt different, quieter, colder. And then came the memo. An anonymous internal document titled The Risk of Emotional Leadership. It outlined the potential dangers of Sundar's direction. It argued that while empathy was admirable, it could not replace performance. That soft leadership might cause hard consequences. It was brutal, but it was strategic. And it spread like wildfire through internal channels. When Sundar read it, he didn't react immediately. He closed his laptop, stood up, and walked out of the building. He didn't go home. He went back to the marina. The bench was empty. He sat there, the wind tousling his hair, the scent of salt water in the air. He didn't need to ask who wrote the memo. He already knew. Victor Drayton had always believed in controlling the narrative, but Sundar believed in something else, letting truth speak for itself. As he sat there, someone approached quietly. A familiar shuffle of footsteps. It was Elias. You look like a man with heavy thoughts, the old man said, settling beside him. Sundar offered a weary smile. Some battles are quiet, but still exhausting. Elias nodded. The hardest ones usually are. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Sundar asked, "What do you do when the people who once lifted you now try to pull you down?" Elias stared at the horizon. You remind them why they lifted you in the first place. And if they've forgotten, you walk forward anyway. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, the words sinking deep. I'm thinking about stepping back, he said, almost in a whisper. Elias turned, eyes sharp. Why? Because I'm not sure the world wants this kind of change. No, Elias said firmly. Some people don't want it. But that's not the same thing. Most people do. They just don't know how to ask for it. They don't have your voice. Sundar looked down at his hands. You think I'm still the right person? I think, Elias said, you're the only one who's not pretending to be someone else. The words pierced through the fog in Sundar's mind, and then his phone buzzed. Single message. From Samir, the teenager who had written the first blog post about Sundar at the marina. It read, Mr. Pichai, I know you probably don't read random messages, but I wanted you to know something. After I saw your story, I started a tech club at my school. Last week, a girl who was always bullied gave her first presentation. She said you made her believe that quiet voices matter. Please don't stop what you're doing. Some of us need to believe it's possible. Sundar stared at the screen for a long time, and something shifted inside him. He stood up. Turned to Elias. Thank you. He said that then he walked back his car, not with the weight of defeat, but with the fire of purpose reignited. The next morning, Sundar didn't hold a press conference. He walked into the Google campus and called a town hall. Thousands of employees, from engineers to janitors, gathered in the auditorium and tuned in virtually from around the globe. He stood alone on the stage. No teleprompter. No polished presentation, just him, and he spoke from the heart. Some people believe kindness is weakness, that humility doesn't belong in leadership, but I've seen what happens when we choose compassion over control, when we listen instead of label. I will not apologize for believing that empathy belongs in boardrooms. I will not apologize for building something that serves people first. A pause. Then he added, and if that makes me unpopular in some circles, so be it. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Slowly. Then louder. Sound. The entire room was on their feet. Victor Drayton watched the speech from his high-rise office across the city. And for the first time in years, he felt something unexpected. Doubt. Because, while he had the power, Sundar had the people. And deep down, even Victor knew movements built on truth don't disappear. They endure. And they evolve. What no one knew yet was that Sundar was about to take the table of 12 to a global scale, and that Victor, feeling his grip slipping, was about to play his final, most dangerous card. Asterisk, the storm becomes a lighthouse morning after the town hall. The Google campus buzzed with renewed energy, not the artificial kind that came from bonuses or announcements. It was something deeper, more personal. Engineers who once avoided speaking up were now gathering in small groups to talk about their ideas. Custodians walked through the halls and found themselves greeted by name. Interns looked around and realized they were not invisible anymore. Something had shifted. Something real. But not everyone was celebrating. In a quiet office on the top floor of an old financial building. Victor Drayton stared at a wall of screens showing media coverage of Sundar's town hall. Each clip reinforced what Victor had feared. Sundar hadn't just survived the pushback, he had turned it into something stronger than before. His honesty, his vulnerability, had done what no viral product ever could. It had changed the conversation across an entire industry. Victor had spent a lifetime building influence through control, through calculation, and now that influence was slipping like sand through his fingers. Sundar was not just a rival anymore, he was a symbol of a new kind of power, one that couldn't be manipulated, bought, or buried in memos. But Victor was not the kind of man who gave up. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and made a single call. Release the report, he said. His team hesitated. Sir, are you sure? Yes, he said coldly. If we're going down, we're taking. The illusion with us? Hours later, news outlets began receiving a confidential leak. It was a lengthy internal report, real emails, real discussions, taken out of context and repackaged to tell a false story. The report claimed that Sundar had used company resources to fund private gatherings, that he had made ideological decisions that threatened shareholder value, that his leadership was rooted more in emotion than logic. It spread like wildfire. The same media that had once praised Sundar's grace now questioned his leadership. Headlines turned sharp. Is Sundar Pichai leading with heart or risking everything? New allegations raised questions about Google's internal priorities. The CEO who traded innovation for inspiration. And inside Google, the unease returned. Whispers started again. Fear crept back in. Meetings turned colder. Employees who had once stood tall now sat with slouched shoulders. Unsure of where they stood, Sundar watched it all happen from his glass-walled office. He didn't speak, didn't post, didn't defend himself. Instead, he made one decision. He picked up his phone, and he called the 12, not assistants, not publicists, not executives. He called the 12 people who had sat around that wooden table in the barn. And he said only one thing. We're expanding the table. Within days, Sundar announced a new initiative. Not to fight the allegations, but to amplify the truth. He called it the Lighthouse Project. A a global initiative to bring together unsung voices in every field education, science, healthcare, community development, and give them platforms, tools, and resources, not to make headlines, not for profit, but to shine light in places that had long been kept in the shadows. The announcement wasn't delivered on a stage. It was filmed in a quiet room with Sundar sitting across from a janitor, a nurse, and a 12-year-old girl who had designed an app to help her blind brother navigate school. The video went viral not because it was flashy, but because it was true, and the world saw it. The backlash that Victor had tried to ignite fizzled out within days. Because the people didn't care about calculated narratives. They cared about connection, and Sundar had given them that. Investors who had once been hesitant now reached out, asking how they could be part of the Lighthouse project. Universities invited Sundar to speak not about business, but about values. Entire companies began reevaluating how they treated the people who didn't sit in corner offices. And somewhere on a quiet dock by the marina, Elias watched the sun rise and smiled, because he knew storms come. But they also reveal who the lighthouses are. Weeks later, Sundar was invited to a conference. The same kind of luxury event that once turned him away. This time, he wore the same navy shirt and worn-out sneakers. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience stood. Not because of his title, not because of his wealth, but because of what he stood for. He began his speech with a story. "A few months ago, I was humiliated on a yacht," he said softly. "Not because of who I was, but because of who they thought I wasn't." The audience leaned in, and I'm grateful for that moment, because it reminded me that the world still struggles to recognize quiet strength, to honor dignity without decoration. But it also reminded me of something more powerful. Kindness always finds a way back. He paused. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, like you don't belong, know this. You are not alone. And your voice matters more than you know. There were no dry eyes in the room. After the conference, a journalist approached him backstage. "Mr. Pichai, what would you say is your greatest achievement so far?" Sundar smiled gently. "Not what I built," he said, "but what I helped others believe they could build." As he walked away, his phone buzzed again. A new message. From Samir. "Mr. Pichai, our tech club just finished building our first app. It's clunky, but it works. We named it Lighthouse. We wanted you to know you lit the first one." Sundar stared at the message. Closed his eyes and breathed deeply. From the outside, it might have looked like just another day. But inside him, a chapter had closed. Not in defeat. But in fulfillment. Because he had taken pain and turned it into power. Humiliation and turned it into hope. And now, the world no longer saw him as just a CEO. They saw him as something far rarer. A lighthouse in the fog. And lighthouses don't shout. They shine. Asterisk.